Hey fellow photographers, welcome back to another episode, actually part 2 with Don Komarechka, and we are going to go through processing infrared. So if you watched last week, we discussed how to do infrared, what equipment you need, tricks. This week we are discussing how to process it because it's a little bit different. Hey Don, how you doing today?
Hey Bob, I'm great. This is a fun topic to discuss because a lot of people, if they get the energy to go and explore infrared photography, which I hope they would have if they listened to the last episode, they'll get the images back on their computer and they'll just be pulling out their hair and not knowing what the heck to do with them because it's just the entire post-processing workflow is different than anything that you've done before. Not to say that it's difficult, but it's different and you won't necessarily know where to start.
Well, yeah, one of the first things you're going to see, is, especially in the back of the camera, which we discussed last week, is the fact that it is going to show up red. And we suggest that you convert it into a black and white or select your black and white function on the back of the camera because that kind of makes more sense to your brain. Looking at something in red just throws you totally out to lunch. But when you get it back on the camera, you import it in the Lightroom or whatever processing program you're using, these images show up red.
Very red. So when we're talking about red, people think, well, I've had red in some of my photographs before. How extreme can this be? Well, we're talking pretty extreme red. We're talking something that is just, holy cow, how can I ever recover from this? This is just complete garbage to me. And Bob, I'm sure you've seen images that look like this on the back of your camera as well, right?
Yep. Oh yeah, several times. More times than I wish to actually look at.
Right. Now this is when you have not set a custom white balance, or when Lightroom is, in this case I'm using Lightroom for the raw processor, is not properly recognizing your white balance selection. One of the fundamental problems with this is you've got to set that color temperature when you adjust white balance to be so cold to compensate for this red. A lot of software, they don't let you go that cold. So in Lightroom, there's an artificial limit on the temperature that sets it to minus 2000. And that's as cold as I can get this to go. And I would probably like to push it even farther, but the software just does not let me change that setting at all. This is as deep as it will go to correct for those colors.
Yeah, but okay, let's start right there, because 9 times out of 10, I don't use Lightroom to process. So for you, what you've done is you've created a profile under the camera settings for this, correct?
That's right. So Lightroom by default does not let me go any slower or any colder than that. But Adobe has software, it's free to use, called their D&G Profile Editor. And all you have to do is bring in one of your images into the software, and then in their color matrices, you just adjust the color temperature all the way to the negative towards blue again, and save that as a custom profile. That will solve this problem for you. So if I go down under camera calibration, in this list I have one that says infrared. And wow, that's way too blue, because now I can control this. I can choose where on that spectrum I want that color to fall and choose exactly where I want both of these to kind of sit within this spectrum and figure out where a good neutral point is going to be for me.
Yeah, see, for me, basically, I just scooted into Photoshop, and that's another way of doing it. This I haven't done. I'll have to throw this onto my...
The one issue with Photoshop, and it's not an issue if you're close enough to neutral, but as soon as you send the image to the proper full version of Photoshop, it's no longer a raw file, it's a TIFF file. And you lose the ability to correct for white balance as strongly when you are dealing with a TIFF file.
Okay.
In this case, the raw processor is Lightroom, just like Adobe Camera Raw would also be a raw processor. Canon's Digital Photo Professional is a raw processor. Capture One and a lot of other, they process the raw data. As soon as it goes to another program, it's no longer raw information. And so white balance is one of those key things to get right before you hand off the raw file to something else.
Okay, so let's get this straight. So you're using Lightroom just to correct the white balance.
I'm just using Lightroom to correct the white balance. Sometimes, and this is if you're just exploring infrared photography for the first time, your images might end up being overexposed because the brightest areas end up clipping before anything else. And so in Lightroom, I'll sometimes bring the highlights down or bring the exposure down slightly. I can bring them back up a little bit, but in raw files, you have a little bit more latitude to recover from your shadows, recover from your highlights. And I just make sure that I'm not too close to the edge as an image in the brightness. So just correct the white balance, bring the exposure down a little bit if it's too hot, and that's it. You don't touch anything else in your raw processor, whether it be Lightroom or anything else.
Yeah, I don't know anybody who's shooting JPEG for infrared.
Well, one of the benefits of shooting JPEG in infrared, if you can call it that, is that you don't have to worry about creating a custom profile and doing all of that whole loop of extra work. It's a set it and forget it thing. You do it once and you never have to create that profile again. And the JPEG file, if you set up proper white balance in camera, you've got it. But I have a hard time ever getting it 100% perfect in camera. You always have to nudge it some way in post. And so from this point, this is where I would take that image and I would send it into Photoshop, which is where the magic happens. Because if you remember from last week, all of my images had a nice blue sky. They had crisp, beautiful, glowing white foliage. But in this case, I've got a rusty color sky, and that just doesn't work for me. I mean, we're dealing with imaginary colors. We have to state that right here, because these colors that we're seeing, the slight blues and oranges, they're remapped from colors that don't exist. The camera can detect wavelengths and differences in wavelengths beyond what we can see with our own eyes, and we pull those back into the color spectrum that we can see. But the colors don't exist, so they're imaginary. We can do whatever we want with these colors to our heart's content. But I find, and I believe most people will as well, that the colors in infrared, if they somewhat mimic reality, it brings a bit more magic to it instead of it feeling fake as a result.
Yeah, so no, I agree with that. Well, we've had that discussion before, and you beat me up on that one before.
Yeah, I could make the sky purple or green if I really wanted to. I mean, again, these colors are imaginary. They don't exist. So that blue sky that I'm always fond of, well, it doesn't have to be blue. It could be any color that you want, depending on what you're after, what you're compositionally trying to create. And in some images, I actually prefer having that orange sky. The night photos that I've done of Toronto, and in some other cases, some nice reflection shots, the orange sky ends up being a really nice compositional piece. But if I'm after some semblance of reality, I need to start swapping these colors around in a way that Lightroom doesn't allow me to do.
Oh, Don, how do you swap these colors around?
Did I lead you right into that one, Bob? All right. So
who says I'm not journalistic? Yeah, okay, because basically for me, I do very little in Lightroom. But now that I'm understanding after talking to you, because Lightroom is going to allow me to adjust my white balance. And it's like, but it's not a white balance. But because we overexpose, 9 times out of 10, I find a lot of my work for infrared is a little bit overexposed. A lot of times. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, or it's a way I'm...
No, it's not just you. And one of the reasons is because the red pickups on the sensor are receiving more light than the green and the blue. It's interesting to note something here, very important though, that while the infrared is you would imagine, well, maybe, why isn't it just all the red pixel on the sensor and not the other two? Because when you get beyond the visible spectrum, the blue and the green dyes that detect colors on the camera sensor itself start to become slightly transparent. And so they do leak infrared light through them. When you get to, I think, the 850 nanometer point, then they're all transparent. The red, the green, and the blue filters on the sensor itself to figure out where colors are, they let all light through. That's why the deep infrared images are always just black and white. You've got no color to play with. So we've got an interesting play where there's a little bit coming through green, a little bit coming through blue, but almost everything coming through red. And so the red light just overexposes. And because that's the predominant case in these images, you often get infrared images that are just a little bit too bright, and those overexposed highlights are hard to pull back.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with that because that's one of the issues I always had. I noticed as I go back through some of my work in infrared is that they're overexposed, especially in the leaves and the.
Yeah. Well, so let's take this image that I've brought the exposure down a little bit. So we've got now, if I were to zoom in on any particular area of the image, you'll notice that I've got shadows, sure, and I've got highlights. But the highlights themselves they're well within the range. I don't think that they're completely overexposed. So I think we're pretty good in that regard. But I need to start swapping things around. I need to create an image that looks a little bit more natural in a certain field. So the start would be to get this as a result. And I'm going to show you how to get here. And then we have to modify it from this point of view. But in this case, I need to get the sky to be a bluish color. Right? And how do I get there from what would normally be the camera output of creating something like this? So we have to swap channels. And the way that it did it right there was with a Photoshop action that I created that takes the red channel and the blue channel and flips them. And so there's two ways to do this. You can do this by actually going into the channel matrix. And in Photoshop, there's channels. You've got red, green, and blue channels. And you can swap the red channel and the blue channel, and each channel in and of itself is only black and white. And so if I swap those, I get that effect that I had showed you a minute ago. There's another way to do it, which I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe it is under Channel Mixer.
Yeah.
And in Channel Mixer, I can mess with these colors here as well, whereas I believe it's something like, oh geez, what have I done? One of these goes one way, one of those goes the other way, and I can create the same kind of effect. Or I can create any color. Like I said, a green sky, you want a green sky? There you go, Bob. There's your green sky. And so we can take these channels, and if I actually go back in there and show you what it should be, I just figured out how it should be. Channel Mixer, the red channel, on that, I'm going to take to a negative. I'm going to take the blue channel and to a, oh geez.
Usually
something like that.
Yeah.
I'm just playing here. I'm creating randomness in these colors and having some fun with the results.
Well, see, I use a channel mixer, and I have an action for that as well. Basically,
right. The thing, regardless of what action you have and how it operates, I've got it mapped to a keyboard shortcut. So all it's going to do is it's going to take the red channel and the blue channel and it's going to swap them, whether you're using the channel mixer or you're actually swapping color channels around. And I've got it mapped on my computer to Control F2, and pressing that just takes the blue, puts it to the red, takes the red, puts it to the blue. You know, we've got, or the other way around, and we've got now this as a result. This is not where we want to be though. This is halfway there. And again, a lot of people might face a bit of a roadblock because when I'm looking for that blue sky, the blue sky is cyan, and I don't really care for a cyan sky. That doesn't really feel natural to me. And the whites that I want in the trees aren't quite there either. So my first step is to bring up an adjustment for hue and saturation. And if I take the cyans in this, and I just sway that to be blue, right? So I'm just taking those colors and I'm making the cyans into a nice blue color tone. And that works for me. That brings me closer towards the reality that I'm trying to create with this kind of an image. So the trick is just using a hue and saturation adjustment, make those cyans into blue, and then we have our magic bullet button. 9 times out of 10 this works. The odd time it doesn't. But under the image menu in Photoshop is the auto tone button. What auto tone does is it not only adjusts for contrast, but it also pulls color casts out of an image. It's great if you're scanning old negatives that have a color cast to them, but it's also great for infrared work because it will just kind of set everything where it should be. So if I press auto tone, it corrects for that brightness. The brightness and the contrast everywhere is roughly where it should be, and it kind of kicks everything to where it wants everything to be. And from this point, I can now start editing this image the way I would edit a normal photograph, looking at certain colors, looking at composition and crops. I can see that there might be a little bit of yellow in here, and I can pull that out if I want to, or I can shift it to be a different color. I have the freedom now at this point to edit this image the way that I would normally edit any other photograph. So I could say, take my yellows, maybe bleed them off a little bit, and say, okay, well, let's let's switch these, maybe green, maybe magenta, maybe even just desaturate them to bring them back to a neutral point, and create more contrast if I want in the image. All of this is just what I create as the final composition, and how I'm working on this image to get that feel, that infrared glowiness, as a technical term, as a final product. The real trick is setting white balance, swapping channels, and getting a blue sky. From there, it's just a regular image with magical qualities.
Well, there we go. Everything I want to know. See, mine usually turn out pink or pinkish.
That's because you didn't get the proper white balance set in Lightroom. That step should not be underestimated in getting a quality neutral image. You want to get the foliage to be as neutral as possible, because if it's off, if it is ever so slightly cyan or purple or whatever color it ends up being in Lightroom or whatever your raw processor is, that color gets inverted when you swap the channels. And so it will be a non-neutral color at that point, and it becomes harder to decontaminate, to pull the color out of if you want neutral white foliage as a result. So getting that foliage to be as neutral as possible is that first step, and that's an important one that kind of cascades through the other steps.
Isn't that interesting? So that's what I've been doing wrong all these years. Not setting. See, again, you've got me caught on the white balance, because once I set a custom white balance in the camera, that's usually where I went with it. But you're just doing that extra piece. So here's my question on setting up the custom white balance. Do you do that for every picture, or just one series? Because you've got a converted camera where I'm using a filter. So do I have to set it up for the series of images I take?
Not necessarily, no. What I would say is that you can create a standard custom white balance that will work in bright sunlight. And that's most of the times when you're going to be using the infrared filter to begin with. And so that's how it's going to interpret bright sunlight. And if you're in any other scenario, that white balance is always going to be a good starting point, and you can always deviate from there. But I'll show you again really quickly what this process would be going through if I share this with another image and show you what's going on here with this. Again, infrared images work best when you've got like some sort of water, you've got sky, you've got foliage. Those are kind of the trifecta of what makes an infrared image kind of have a magical feel to it. Now, in this image, I photographed it at different spectrums. So this is at a one that adds a little bit more color into it, a 665 nanometer. This one at 590 nanometer, but the classic infrared, 720 nanometer, that's your standard infrared filter, is the one that I always go back to because it gives me a nicer contrast in the overall image. Now, again, if I'm in Lightroom, I'm going to be developing this photograph by bringing the exposure down just a little bit, because some of these highlights are a bit too bright for me. So those come down, and maybe those highlights just a little bit further, just take the edge off of those brightest areas. And then in this image, would have already chosen my 1DX infrared filter. If I went back to the standard, you'll see how the colors just do not match at all, right? They're just completely skewed, and they're not giving me that nice neutral foliage look. I can get that neutral look when I'm dealing with the custom settings that I've got in here. So then from there, I'll just edit that in Photoshop, and Photoshop will jump up, and in a second, we'll bring up that image. I swap the channels, which again, I've got set up as an action, so it'll just swap them around. Then I will create an adjustment, hue and saturation, and take my cyans, and I'm going to shift them to be more bluish in this case. This is a less saturated image than the previous one, but the same idea applies. And then hit that magic auto tone button, and it just pumps everything up. Now, in this particular case, I've noticed something that is indicative of a lot of infrared photography. And you'll notice that the sky, sort of up in this area, is dark and has a bit of color to it. But right in the middle of the frame, it has less contrast and maybe a bit of a color cast to it as well. This is called an infrared hotspot. And this is common in a lot of lenses. And the exact cause is somewhat unknown. If you see it, well, you can try to avoid it by shooting with a wider open aperture, but oftentimes it's just a post-processing thing where you have to darken down the center of the frame and adjust the contrast there to avoid that particular issue. there is some databases online that will show you what lenses are affected more than others in this particular case. But to be honest, you'll always see it. And if you see it, you know that that's just another step that you have to deal with in post-processing. So when we get to this stage, the easiest way for me to deal with that is in Photoshop, you have the ability to use a camera raw filter. And camera raw is the exact same kind of panel and output as Lightroom is itself. And I can create a radial filter in here. And that radial filter, I can choose to cover just the center of the frame and cover the inside of that. And I'm going to reset these settings because they're all wonky from something else that I was dealing with. So reset those settings. I'm just going to increase the contrast and maybe shift the color tint a little bit. And bingo, that problem is gone. Maybe drop the exposure just a tiny bit in that center there as well. So that is how I take that hotspot and remove it, just like so, before and after. And so again, that's just, it's a post-processing step that you have to go through if you encounter that problem to return your image back to that kind of normal flow that you're trying to get to. And at this point, we're at that normal flow. So I would then crop, adjust contrast or brightness as I see fit to make this a useful image.
There we go. I just got scolded again. I'm not doing my infrared images properly. Okay, so, but here's the kicker. For you people that are out here watching this, believe it or not, Don has a book coming out on infrared. When's the book coming out?
It'll be out in late spring, cross my fingers, which is right when the foliage will be fully on the trees and ready for everybody to start exploring infrared to its fullest again. So it's timed to be when this camera will be most likely in your hands, and you'll need that help to make the most out of it.
Right. Now, does the book, because now I'm more interested in the book, and I think we've talked about this before, does the book cover filters as well as converted cameras?
It'll cover everything. It will be the Bible of infrared photography.
I've seen your snowflake book. Is it the same size?
I'm not sure yet. I'm working on it right now. It's going to be out in ebook format first, and then I will do a physical print run of it at a later date. So it'll be easy to access everywhere when you're out in the field and you need to reference something when you're out shooting or what have you. Then it will be there as a companion on your phone or your tablet, ready for you to cross those stumbling blocks with some nice strides to say, okay, well, I can't see the image. What's the solution to that? Well, there will be the full tutorial on that out there as well.
Okay, because I've got your snowflake book, and I'm honestly thinking of going to get the Coles abridged version.
I might make a smaller ebook version of that in the future as well. It's almost sold out. The entire print run, I've only got a few hundred copies left of that. So.
Okay, so where can people find you online, Don?
Well, my website is donkom.ca, donkom.ca. And so that's where you'll find all of my links to social media. I encourage you to follow all of the crazy stuff that I'm up to photographically. And you might also be interested, Bob, that I've launched a podcast as well. If you like all of the mad scientist, crazy propeller hat stuff that I do, you might want to check out Inside the Lens, which is the name of my podcast, at insidethelens.com.
Awesome. So there we go. Thanks for joining us. It's always great having you on. So if you people out there have been watching us, that was complete system on how to do infrared. Last week we did it on what equipment you need, how to use the equipment. This week was on how to post-process it. If you're looking for the action, I know Don will give it to me and I'll upload it to the website so you can download the action. Don't forget there's a few other steps. Also, great tutorial on how to correct the white balance. Never knew about that one, so there we go. I got schooled again. Bye, Don. So that's great there. Thanks, Don. It's always wonderful to having you on. I'm really looking forward to the book. I know I've been pressuring you on it.
Yes, there's a lot of pressure. The images that I just showed you were shot for the book, and so they're going to be edited and all at different frequencies or at different wavelengths of light so that people can see exactly what the best solution is going to be for them. And of course, some of them will be used in a post-processing tutorial that you can follow along step by step.
Awesome. All right. So we got to go. Again, it's always wonderful. Always appreciate you being here. And thank you guys for watching. And we'll see you next time on Who Said Photography.